can't be serious, man. You cannot be serious!
Now, these sort of chats are fraught with danger because some extreme views, and we love to do this, incidentally, because it's just food for thought. But extreme views are not necessarily held by me or the people on this podcast, but they're views enough which are out in the wider area, the community, that people actually are interested in chatting about, because while you mightn't think that there's any validity to them, there's a hell of a lot of chat about them. So with that in mind, I've got Richard Wollstonecroft here from MUFF, the Melbourne Underground Film Festival, affectionately known as Dick from MUFF.
Morning, Sam. How are you?
Good. And Dick has brought in with him a man called Paul
Moder.
No, I know your name's Paul Moder. I was just going to read out who you are.
Oh, okay.
Paul Moder. This is what I have written down here. Is an Australian in the Australian entertainment industry for nearly 40 years. He's a producer of an award-winning film called Razor Eaters. He's a owner once of, maybe still, the Bohemian Cabaret Club. I don't know if he still owns that. He's a film star. Hang on. He's a film star. He's a novelist. He's currently working on The Wasp Files. And the reason I've asked Paul to come in here today, along with Dickie, is that he has I don't know if you call it a conspiracy theory, but he has a theory about, well-researched, he'll tell us how well-researched it is, about the Port Arthur shooting and massacre down in Tasmania all those years ago. And I thought it was worth having a chat to him about it, because I've not heard this before, and if I'm interested in what he has to say, I reckon the people who listen to this. So first of all, Paul Moder, welcome to You Cannot Be Serious. And how much of that did I get right or wrong?
Oh, you got it all right, pretty much. Still a few dubious creative endeavours on the go, but the Cabaret Club's no longer. But I still make films as well.
And you're a film armourer, you were saying?
Yeah, I'm a licensed pyrotechnician. I have a high explosives licence. I blow things up for film and TV, which is very cathartic.
Film and TV? Yes.
Just for film and TV, of course.
Just while we're on that, what did you make of the man getting acquitted of, what's his name, the film star in America?
Alec Baldwin.
Alec Baldwin. I didn't know that he was acquitted.
He was acquitted because they said they couldn't quantify, or he got acquitted.
He was, yeah.
But
I think there's a civil case going on. We're going to try and do a civil.
He'll be sued because he was the producer, so the safety aspects of him running his film shoot come into play. But the armourer should go straight to jail for their negligence in that accident. I'll say dereliction of duty.
Anyhow, that's what you do. And so in the Australian film industry, you'd be kept busy overseeing all those the fireworks and the pyrotechnics, and often staggered as to how people, when there's a gunfight or a shooting, how they show the bullet holes in cars and the blood coming out of people. It's quite an involved technique, I'd suggest, Paul.
It's the art of illusion, but it's a very dangerous art of illusion, and there are people that get killed and hurt, as we saw with the Rust production. And it's always a worry. It's something I do on the side. I pretty much have the license to do effects for my own films because it's very expensive to hire people to do that.
So Dick said you should speak to this man about the particular thing that I'm interested in. We can speak about all your other, the raft of things that you're involved in. But when he said that there's some doubt and about what happened in Port Arthur, I thought, well, I've not heard that before. So just tell us how you got into this and what your theory is and how long you've been investigating what went on with Martin Bryant and the Port Arthur massacre.
I started off in 2016. I made a decision I wanted to make a film about Port Arthur, which is one of the blackest days in our Australian history. So it was going to be a full-length drama feature. And as part of that job, I thought, well, I'll have to research the crime and Martin Bryant. It was going to be a biopic about Martin Bryant. All I knew was what everyone else knew, that Martin Bryant went down there and shot up Port Arthur with an AR-15 equivalent rifle. So I began the research and I dug very, very deeply, not just what I read online and the news reports, but I spoke to the first responders, the police, survivors, the families of the victims, people who grew up with Martin, people who went to school with him, people who spent time with him in prison after the event. And the deeper I dug over 8 exhaustive years, I came to the conclusion that Port Arthur stinks to high heaven, that the mainstream story is not the full story. There's definitely a cover-up, and there's a lot of unresolved questions.
So Paul, it might be unpalatable and it might be insensitive to even speak about this because there's plenty of victims, as we know. But why do you think that this is not, as we say, kosher? Why this is not as it seems?
I think one of the
how were you first alerted to the fact that this is not quite as it seems?
I think what first came out that I found was astounding was that this, I can't state the impact of this enough, this was the biggest mass shooting by a lone gunman in world history at the time, and we didn't have a mandated coronial inquest.
How many people passed away?
35 people killed, 28 injured.
Yep.
And
so it's the biggest mass shooting in Australian history.
In the world, at the time, by a lone gunman.
Yep.
And we didn't have a coronial inquest, no open trial, no public inquiry.
There was no trial, was there?
No. The reason for that was that Martin had pled guilty, and I can certainly cover the spurious nature of that confession down the track. But I was astounded by the fact that this was an enormous tragedy and crime that affected the whole world and, of course, Australia. And it's mandated by state law, not federal law. And John Howard, our Prime Minister at the time, quashed the coronial inquest.
And it did have a political outcome in the sense because afterwards it was a huge push to take away guns from the average Australian. Because Australia was to some extent a bit of a gun nation. It was never like America. But there was still a country where guns were reasonably...
We still are a gun country. There are more guns in Australia now than before Port Arthur in 1996. And yes, John Howard... basically after the Port Arthur massacre brought in sweeping changes to remove semi-automatic high-powered rifles, pump-action shotguns, and you can still get firearms in Australia, but we have some of the toughest firearm laws.
So, Paul, you just said the spurious nature of the confession of Bryant's. You should explain what that means.
Okay, Martin Bryant was basically a bit of an idiot. He was diagnosed as having an IQ of 66. He was a very troubled young man. I actually don't want to denigrate him and call him an idiot because he had mental health problems, and he was ostracised, lonely, and basically was the person that was accused and convicted of going down to Port Arthur and shooting up the tourist colony and killing all those people.
So I'm just trying to fill in just the natural layman's questions I'd ask in response to what you're saying. Are you saying it's improbable, highly unlikely, that a man who has an IQ of 66 would be able to take a, whatever gun you said it was, down to a place called Port Arthur, kill 34 people, wound how many more you said, on his own, reloading the gun, or you're saying someone is not capable of doing that if they are an idiot?
Having known firearms, I'm a shooter and I know firearms very well. I know the Colt SB1 or AR-15 variant very well. Yes, people say, look, it's easy to pull a trigger, but when you consider the magnitude of that crime, the multiple staged assault sites, the pre-planning of the siege at the Seascape Cottage where the shooting ended up, the ability to evade police, the ability to decoy the only police at Port Arthur to the other side of the island before the shooting on a wild goose chase to find drugs that turned out to be soap powder in jars. It was a very well executed and planned event that, as distressing
someone
as it
like
sounds,
he would not be capable of doing. That's your premise?
Well, most modern-day terrorists would consider that a major achievement, and this was carried out inevitably by a man who was put on a guardianship order by the Hobart Supreme Court in 1993, rendered mentally incapable of handling his affairs.
So, in effect, Paul, you're saying there was a huge cover-up. For what reason? That this was a precursor, as Dick said, to getting rid of guns in Australian society, or what was the reason there is a cover-up, if in fact you're saying there is?
I've always said that gun control alone is a motivation for a government involvement or shady agency involvement in Port Arthur is too puerile a motive. The oldest motivators in the book, going back through centuries, and you only have to study history: power, money, influence and control. There are always people that benefit from major traumatic events, and power, of course. Even our Prime Minister John Howard became our Teflon PM after Port Arthur with 4 terms, and he'd wrestled the gun control narrative away from the Liberals who traditionally owned it.
So who is if you say this wasn't Bryant, who is the motivation behind getting Bryant as a scope? Are you saying Bryant wasn't there at all, or are you saying
he was definitely there and he was definitely involved? Because of his antisocial behaviour, his violent tendencies, and his access to money and firearms, he inherited a lot of money. He's the perfect patsy. And my opinion is that he was helped and or set up by some very shady individuals, and that by his own admission, he was at Seascape Cottage where he was arrested, but that he didn't do the Port Arthur shooting.
So the WASP Files is a documentary, if you like, on this very matter, is it?
It's an open discussion with interviews and ongoing online on YouTube, just to discuss all aspects of the case.
Interviews with whom?
Interviews
Survivors.
with police, first-hand survivors, some of mine who are friends. I have information from people that has never come to light before, certainly hasn't been seen in the mainstream media or in a court of law, who cast very, very concrete doubts on the mainstream story.
Have you interviewed any of the survivors?
Yes.
And without putting words in your mouth, have those interviewees that you've spoken to said, yep, we were there, we saw Bryant shoot at me or us, and shoot all the people, and they said something didn't seem right, or are they just a bit bewildered by what you're on about?
It's quite distressing to know I have good friends who are direct survivors, one of whom took a bullet in the throat on the day, and he watched the shooter enter the cafe. He's a very remarkable, switched-on, observant fellow. And he said he walked in and he noticed him because he had a military bearing about him, but he had this long blonde hair.
Yep.
And went out, came back into the cafe, started shooting, and my friend tried to save his loved ones and pushed them away and turned back and took a bullet in the throat. He told me firsthand the person who shot him was not Martin Bryant. I said, are you sure? He said 100%.
So the person who walked in with the long blonde hair and the military rig and kit, he said that wasn't the man that was charged and as a consequence is in jail as we speak.
Correct. And he also said later...
How did he quantify that, Paul?
He made a witness statement to that. He's never been interviewed by the media on shows like the ABC's I Was There. He's never been called up as a first-hand witness in a court of law because there was no open trial. He was in hospital, and above him, Martin Bryant was being treated, and the police brought in an identikit board, and he said the photos were so fuzzy you could have put a blonde wig on Big Bird.
So, Paul, if that person who was shot in the throat said that wasn't Martin Bryant, I just asked you, was Martin Bryant there? So you're saying, or you, I think, are saying directly or indirectly that he wasn't there, Martin Bryant, wasn't at the, or was he somewhere else? That's
my opinion, that the shooter that was sent into the tourist colony, as outrageous and far-fetched as it seems, was not Martin Bryant.
And where was Martin Bryant, the person who's in jail, where was he at the time?
He was kept at Seascape Cottage.
Because there was some kind of confrontation at Seascape Cottage. That came afterwards, is that correct?
Yeah, the shooting ended up at a little Airbnb cottage outside of the Port Arthur colony called Seascape Cottage. The owners of that cottage were murdered, and Martin Bryant was arrested at that cottage after there was a siege where shots were fired from the cottage.
There is a kind of a Port Arthur truther movement. You're not the only person who has this theory. There are many others who have said this. I mean, they're not like an online internet movement of people. I've seen other people cover this story. Like the 9/11 truth movement. There are people that think there's more going on with 9/11. Mm-hmm. So what is the general thesis of this truther movement? You know what I mean? Can you summarise what they basically believe? And I guess, do you believe that?
The basic premise is that Martin Bryant was the perfect kind of patsy, and that he was set up to take part in a false counterintelligence exercise, if you like. And there was a SACPAV exercise, which is the Standing Acting Committee on Prevention Against Violence by Counterintelligence Police on the Tasman Peninsula in the months before Port Arthur. So there were counterintelligence police, tactical police carrying out exercises. Yep. So the theory is that he was tricked into taking part into an exercise, going to Seascape Cottage and told, look, you will read from this script and you will shoot out the windows and keep people at bay, and that while he was there he was incapacitated or drugged, and that they sent a professional person in impersonating him in his Volvo with his guns, who then carried out a very successful assault at the tourist penal colony.
Just pardon me if you might have just said that. I was just looking up, so the Kennedy files have just come out about the conspiracy about all that, and people say, well, we can keep going over that, but probably the real explanation still hasn't been released. And I was just looking up Stephen Paddock, who killed 50-odd people at the Mandalay Bay in Las Vegas. They still haven't found out what in the hell he was doing, and there's been no investigation into that. You might have just told Dick this while I was looking that up. Who did we say you thought was behind this person who wasn't Martin Bryant, who walked into the cafe? Who are you saying is behind this? The government? Who? Who are you saying is...
That's the salient question. I would say that John Howard wasn't involved. He was shrewd enough a politician to exploit the tragedy. But I would say that there were shady aspects of intelligence agencies and rogue tactical police that were involved in the setup of Martin Bryant.
For what reason? What is their ulterior motive?
The ulterior motive, I believe, once again, power, money, influence and control.
But what money and what power would be apparent by killing 34 odd people and wounding a hell of a lot more? What power and influence would you derive from doing that in a little town in Tasmania? Sure.
What was the operations kind of like modus operandi? You know, why did they do it? I mean, to disarm Australians of their weapons?
That would have been part of it, I believe. We know that the United Nations 2030 agenda certainly has, a factually based report that they wish total civilian disarmament by 2030. But I would also say with money, it's interesting that Martin had inherited a lot of money because he had an association with the heiress from the lone surviving heiress from the Tattersalls fortune, and she left him after her death about over $500,000. But he was also, there was some mention that he might have been privy to the 2 packages of the Tattersalls shares, which would have been worth $29 million. That money has disappeared. I don't know who's got that, where that went.
So Martin Bryant went out with, you say Martin Bryant went out with the heiress or associate of Tattersalls?
He befriended, she was quite an eccentric lady living by herself.
This man who's an IQ of 66 went out with the Tattersalls
I don't think there was a romantic entanglement, but they became friends. She was an odd lady and he was an odd person. He was doing gardening and helping her out. She had a plethora of pets and dogs and cats. And
so she was after his money, maybe?
No, she was the one that provided him with money because she died and she left him all her money and property in her will.
There's a rumour that he might have been involved in her death as well because she died in a car accident. And one of the things Martin Bryant would do is that when you're driving with him is he would grab the wheel of the car.
Yep.
And there's a film called Nitram, which actually explores his life up to the point of the Port Arthur massacre, that shows that side of his life and how he got to know this Tattersalls woman.
Who said that he grabbed the wheel? Where does that come from?
That's actually on record.
That's factual. Helen Harvey would complain, that was the heiress, that, Martin, she said, what to be done with Martin? I have to drive at 30 kilometres because he would just wrench down on the wheel. So Martin certainly had some indications that he might have had a pretty severe autism spectrum disorder,
Yeah.
or this erratic and dangerous behaviour.
Now, Sue made a good point
and she
before.
was killed in a head-on collision, whether or not Martin had... Sorry, what was your point?
No, I'll mention it myself then. There is a point that because he was on the autism spectrum, could that explain why he was so accurate?
Maybe he was on the spectrum. I've read all of the psych
But could that
reports,
explain you being
and
a good shot? Like, because it was incredible marksmanship at Port Arthur. Is that correct? As
to a
gun
certain
expert.
extent. I don't think I'll support that because...
Do you have to reload the gun? Or it had that many bullets in its magazine?
It had a 30-round magazine. The gun was a Colt SP1.
So he would have had to reload it if he's shot 34 and wounded a hell of a lot more.
Sure. 20 people died at close range in the Broad Arrow Cafe. That's the majority of the victims taken, and they were virtually at contact to, bare metres away. So technically it was like shooting fish in the proverbial barrel.
But there were some people he
Disrespectful.
got at like 200 or 300 metres, because Chopper Reed talks about
He
that in that
switched
video.
to a much more high-powered and long-range rifle, commonly known as the SLR, or FAL, which was
So he had two guns with him
he had possibly more than two.
as he walked into the cafe.
There was, the witnesses say he came in with a large bag that he was struggling with. They also said he came in with a grey camera video bag,
This is Martin Bryant, a man who's got an IQ of 66.
supposedly, and basically opened fire with the weapons, and then went outside and continued firing outside with longer range weapons.
Was this before Julian Knight, or was Julian Knight after?
This was after Julian Knight.
After. So after Julian Knight. So if you needed an excuse to take guns off people in Australia, why would you have to wait till Martin Bryant did it? You could have done it when Julian Knight shot up the people in Hoddle Street, couldn't you? Wouldn't
John
that be a
Cain,
good excuse to have done it then?
John Cain banned semi-automatic rifles in Victoria as a result of Hoddle Street, and there was a huge kerfuffle between politicians at the time trying to get uniform gun laws. Barry Unsworth, the former New South Wales Premier, was quoted famously as saying, "There will never be uniform gun laws in Australia until there's a massacre in Tasmania."
In Tasmania?
Yeah. Specifically what he said, lo and behold, some people say that's foreknowledge, but it could have just been a coincidental comment. But Tasmania and Queensland had very lax gun laws as opposed to the rest of the
You've
state.
spoken to Martin Bryant.
No, they won't let me see him.
Have you
Will
tried to?
anyone allowed to speak to... Has Martin Bryant ever been interviewed?
No.
And no one has
He was
ever made
interviewed
inquiries?
by police initially after being held in solitary confinement for 5 months. He was interviewed without legal counsel. At the start of the interview, he asked, "Should I have a lawyer present?" And they said, "Oh, he knows about this." So they conducted an interview without legal counsel for someone who was mentally deficient.
Does he, to this day, have a lawyer that is retained? Did the Crown give him a lawyer who have pushed back on the fact that either he wasn't there and it's some other, to your call, saying it's a conspiracy theory? Why hasn't anyone ever come out that's been appointed a lawyer to him and said this wasn't Martin Bryant?
That goes back to the spurious nature of Martin Bryant's confession, which was the reason we didn't have an open trial and why they just threw him in jail and threw away the key. They said, well, he's confessed, we don't need to have a trial, we don't need to present hard evidence. His so-called defence lawyer, John Avery, was brought in after his initial lawyer, David Gunson, was dismissed, and John Avery, who was later convicted of theft and jailed, was anything but a defence lawyer. Rather than even go for an insanity plea on a person who was on a guardianship order, he went to Martin's mother, Carleen Bryant, and she confessed this in her book, My Story, and said, "You need to get Martin to change his plea to guilty." Carleen went to the prison with John Avery and said, "Unless you change your plea, you'll never see me or your sister Lindy again." Result, Martin changes his plea to guilty after 5 months of holding it staunchly. I'll also say that there is indications Martin was tortured in prison. I have information. One of the guards said they used to handcuff him to his wheelchair and wheel him in under hot water in the shower, and said, quote, this person's name was Peter. It said, quote, "You could hear the screams throughout the cell block."
So is there a transcript of Martin Bryant's interview with the police, the questions he was asked and the answers he gave? Is there a transcript? And
There
what questions was he asked and what answers did he give? He said, yeah, I took a bag full of rifles and ammunition and I came in there and I did all this and it was me and I wasn't wearing a wig. Oh, what questions was he asked and what answers did he give?
The transcript was read out in the pre-trial hearing, and 65 pages of that transcript were redacted. Wow. When you consider the two side by side, which I have, I've got the DPP copy, Martin is a lot more on the ball. He, on multiple occasions, says, I did not go down to Port Arthur, or I do not recall. He doesn't admit to anything other than kidnapping Glenn Pearce, who was one of the victims who ended up at Seascape, and confused memory of a car explosion and him being burnt in a fire at Seascape. That's the only thing he admits to.
So, Paul, do you think you'll be accused of just making a documentary that will captivate people's imagination called The Wasp Files when they'll say it might be just a vehicle to foist your reputation in the public arena as a filmmaker?
Port Arthur has been a thorn in my side for 8 years. I just wanted to make a film. I will indeed make a film. I did actually bring the concept to Justin Kurzel, who directed Nittram and Snowtown, and to Stan.
Snowtown, wow.
And they both at the time said, no, we don't want to make a film about this. And then they took the idea and made Nittram, which is fine. I could give a damn about my reputation in the film industry. I'm not in the Australian film industry. I'm on the outer skirts of it. I don't make any money from this. It costs me money. I get death threats all the time and threats of violence about it.
About this?
Yes.
From
punters, I've been unofficially warned off by ex-ADF, Australian Defence Force and police, saying leave it alone. So it's not a pleasant experience.
One of the high-profile people was Walter Meekak, who's lost
his two young daughters and his wife.
Milana and Madeline, I think. Does he take exception to this, or have you spoken to him, or is he quite not relaxed? Is he quite okay with you delving into this? Would he like to know the answers, or is he satisfied that what's happened has happened? Not satisfied, but you know what I mean.
Walter's loss was profound, and I understand he's taken on board the mantle of preventing violence in Australian society, particularly by banning firearms. So I can certainly understand that loss. As I said, I've got good friends that are direct survivors of Port Arthur, one of whom lost his wife in the cafe, and they support what I do. They've never had their say. And they've been interviewed on the Wasp Files, and one of the issues with not having a coronial inquest...
Why hasn't there been a coronial inquest?
Because it was quashed, ostensibly because they didn't want to upset any survivors by dragging them through the event.
Through the mud, yeah.
But there was a locked fire exit door at the Broad Arrow Cafe on a government-controlled tourist site, and as a result of that door being nailed shut, 7 people lost their lives because they couldn't escape the cafe. Stephen Howard, who lost his wife, was adamant, along with others, to call for a coronial inquest.
Now, Martin Bryant's his mother says he's innocent. I remember that.
Yep.
She's always maintained his innocence. So the accusation is that because he was he has a low IQ, that he was somebody who was pressured over months.
Yes.
And then he eventually had to confess so he could continue seeing his family or whoever. Yeah. Is that the accusation?
Well, God knows what they did to him in 5 months in solitary confinement.
So Paul, I've probably asked you this 3 times and probably not as succinctly as... Well, I want to know, what is the ulterior motive besides the people who wanted Martin Bryant or someone posing as Martin Bryant to shoot and wound and injure all those people? You say it's money and power and career, I don't know. What is the underlying motivation of the federal police and the authorities and the government? What is the underlying motivation for them wanting Martin Bryant to do this?
Why would they do it? Why would they go to this trouble?
How could you make money out of it? What power and income or financial reward would you get for this happening?
Well, I think on a greater level, one of the things that is taken into account whenever there's a major traumatic event is the control of the mass population. So even if you consider things like 9/11, suddenly you've got increased powers of surveillance. They can seize offshore funding that technically they wouldn't have been able to grab in the past.
Department of Homeland Security.
Implement control mechanisms like CCTV cameras everywhere. They can delve into people's
Increased
accounts.
totalitarianism.
Basically, yes. That's on one level. On the other level, I would say, and this is going to be a little interesting, is that, in my opinion, and we could talk a little bit about the experimentations by intelligence agencies like the CIA with the factual existence of things like MKUltra, which is a mind control program in the 60s that was designed to create basically hypnotized assassins, that sometimes they can put experiments into the field just to see if they work.
Yep.
To say, well, we've done all these experiments, we have these theories. MKUltra is a fact. It was shut down by Congress in the 1960s, supposedly, and it was also brought to Australia in the 1960s. The CIA brought MKUltra with Professor Orne in the 1960s to Australia, and Professor Orne was doing experiments on turning ordinary civilians into antisocial people.
Yep.
And committing acts up to and including attempted murder.
It is timely because there's this JFK release
This was
files.
an ABC report.
Yeah.
The JFK files are being released, and RFK Jr. is questioning what happened with his own father. He claims that it wasn't Saran who Saran was in the room and he did 5 shots, but there was somebody behind his father who pulled the trigger, according to RFK Jr. So it is interesting that it does seem like a lot of these conspiracies are
Okay,
being
so
discussed.
so we've gone from Paul.
Down the rabbit hole we go.
Yeah, so we've gone from Martin Bryant walking in there to shooting and wounding all those people, to him not being the person who did it by one of the people who was shot in the throat, to the government intervention, political intervention, and the federal police, to the CIA, to the MK Ultra, to the mind control of people from afar. It goes on and on. Where is this headed with your documentary film, the Wasp Files?
Ongoing sort of.
Now you've got an online documentary, right? You've got you're producing online content at the moment.
The Wasp Files is an ongoing video filmed podcast, which is just an open discussion for educational purposes. My job is to teach people.
And what would
they
people
don't know
discuss
about
on it?
Port Arthur.
How many videos have you got up already?
About 20.
20. And you want to make a feature though, so that's different.
I do want to do a full drama feature that, very much like the film JFK, sort of explores both aspects of the story. Look, I don't have the definitive answers because the government has locked down the hard evidence on file, ballistics, DNA, fingerprints, till 2091.
It's a long time.
So one of my other problems with Port Arthur is, after the initial crime, the Hobart Supreme Court said we'll put a 30-year ban on release of the evidence. I went, okay, that was due to expire in 2026. After I announced I was going to make a film about Port Arthur and kicked up a bit of a stink, Tahoe, which is the Tasmanian Archives Heritage Office, had a video conference saying they were getting all of the files and evidence from Port Arthur, digitising them and locking them down under the highest restrictive category, E75, Chief Commissioner's eyes only, for a further 75 years. That means you, me, Martin Bryant, everyone associated will be dead before those evidence is ever released.
Long dead.
Why?
So
Why?
you brought in a list of the victims, the fatalities here. They obviously can't speak, but their next of kin and families and friends, have you spoken to any of them about what, or it's not relevant to speak to them because
Very relevant. I have the highest respect for the first responders, the police, and the victims and their survivors. And I've spoken to a lot of them. I've befriended some of these people.
What do they say about what you're on about?
Some of them are angry at what I'm doing. A lot of people, particularly the Tasmanian community, they just want to bury it. They don't want to talk about it. I don't believe people should be defined by tragedy, but as I said, I've got a thorn in my side. I have to do my best to educate people on what they don't know about Port Arthur. And ask. I've always said when people say conspiracy theorists, there's nothing wrong with asking questions, particularly in the absence of information. Locked down till 291.
There does seem to be a number of unusual questions in this case. Why do you think mainstream media never examines it?
Well,
Like,
as we
like
know,
Four Corners or 60
look,
Minutes? Or
and Sam would certainly be no stranger to controversy in this regard. The mainstream media is a double-edged sword. They toe the company line, and their job is to sell copy, and they will basically dictate the news. And if they like you, if you're a golden boy, they put you on the pedestal. If they don't, they rip you to pieces. They are liars, and as far as I'm concerned, the mainstream media have very little integrity nowadays.
Well, Paul Motor, I find this extraordinary. I've never even been involved in thinking anything else but of course, you bring this up, and other people bring it up, and you think, wow, that is extraordinary. So
It's the tip of the iceberg.
Is it?
So much to once you do your research. Like me,
are there any websites that you can recommend to people? Because you're not the only person who's thought this, obviously.
So,
the best book to read is by a fellow called Noel MacDonald, and it's called Port Arthur Prelude to a Royal Inquest. It's the most arguably scientific read and study.
So,
and all those files are available.
in all
on my
these things,
sites.
the only person who would know what was going on and what the truth is the man in jail who's got an IQ of 66.
Whom no one can talk to.
And is that by design, or just because there's... Why wouldn't someone be given an entree from some credible media source or some credible police force or intel agency to go and just ask him, could he just give us just might be a lie, but could you just give us a definitive...
You know, Charles Manson, Ed Kemper, John Wayne Gacy, they've all been interviewed, they've given documentaries, they've spoken their piece about why they did what they did.
But there seems
to be Australia.
Maybe that's the bigger conspiracy theory as to why no one is allowed to interview him.
My letter sent to Martin Bryant was seized by the Risdon prison as a risk to prison security.
There you
Didn't
go.
even get to see it.
But
they shut me down.
and why does
before I
no
even
mainstream
applied.
people try and see him? I mean, there seems to be certain events like 9/11, like this Mandalay shooting, where you wonder why do mainstream media not question the event more? Because like Building 7 falling down, like how the hell did that happen? You know, not to get into that, but
I think they just toe the company line.
Now,
And that's the problem, is that as we know, media's lost all objectivity, and it should be with any major event. If you want to put Port Arthur to bed, and I've always said this, they could end this overnight. Release the hard evidence that's on file. Okay, he's done and dusted. He did it. We're never going to have an inquest, and he's never going to get out of prison. Release the information. Say, look, there's his fingerprints. There's his DNA. I spoke to the New South Wales Forensics Police, who, quote, crawled all over the Broad Arrow Cafe. They've got that stuff. They could say, that's Martin Bryant. He went in with a video camera. So ostensibly, he allegedly filmed the assault. That's been...
because if
there
they have
is
nothing to
footage of
hide,
that camera
why
sitting next to the
if
gun
they have
back.
nothing to hide, why so
Exactly.
much?
If he's done and dusted, let's, for
Righto.
historical purposes, release the evidence.
we're going round in circles, and they're good circles to go round in. Just the Bohemian Cabaret Club, what happened there? What was that? You had that as a restaurant, was it, or a...
Look, I've been involved sort of on the outskirts of the arts for many years, and I ran a beautiful licensed restaurant, bar and cabaret show spot called Bohemia Cabaret
Where?
Club in South Melbourne. In
I
the heart of
see,
South
yep.
Melbourne. It was a beautiful venue. We went into liquidation. We ran it for 3 years and it went under.
I see.
but I was very proud of it. We
And
did
you were
burlesque.
involved with Witches and Britches and one of those Draculas.
Oh,
weren't you?
yeah.
I worked in the. I did theatre restaurant for 11 years, and I did every ridiculous send up you can imagine. I've dragged up more than most drag queens, and I
Well-
loved it. So I've been.
Well, now, look, Paul Motor, thank you so much for coming in. We'll probably take another belting for speaking to someone about something that is, well, I don't know what we
Took a belting from Wally.
We take a
Ali
belting from
project.
everyone who we speak to. But anyhow, thank you so much for coming in. And Paul Moder, in the Australian entertainment industry.
Outside the Australian entertainment industry.
Well,
On
you're
the
in the
outskirts.
Australian entertainment
fringes.
industry. Well, you're on the fringes of the Australian entertainment industry for nigh on 40 years. Thank you for coming in.
Pleasure. Thank you, Sam. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, mate.